In controlled social psychology experiments at Princeton and MIT, participants were repeatedly rated as more dominant despite showing no increase in speech, aggression, or facial expression. The only measurable difference was reduced micro-reactivity and slower behavioral output. The interpretation of intimidation emerged before any conscious evaluation occurred. In 1971, researchers studying group behavior at Stanford observed a recurring pattern during controlled social simulations. Participants who were not given authority, rank, or instructions to dominate were still consistently identified by others as intimidating within minutes of interaction. No threats were made, no aggression was displayed, no overt status signals were assigned. Yet perception stabilized quickly, and it remained stable even when subjects attempted to behave neutrally. The most striking detail was this: intimidation was not linked to what people did, but to what others inferred from minimal behavioral cues. In follow-up studies across social psychology labs, a similar effect appeared in workplaces, classrooms, and even casual conversations. A consistent question emerged: what exactly is being detected when nothing obvious is happening? This phenomenon sits at the intersection of nonverbal signaling, predictive social cognition, and what Daniel Kahneman would describe as System 1 threat evaluation, the brain's automatic classification of safety versus uncertainty. The core concept is perceived dominance without behavioral aggression. It refers to the way the human nervous system assigns threat value to individuals based on subtle cues: stillness, gaze stability, emotional restraint, and behavioral economy. Albert Mehrabian's early work on nonverbal communication showed that meaning is disproportionately carried through tone and presence rather than content, but later research refined this further. It is not expression that matters most, but reduction of expressive leakage. By the end of this analysis, you will be able to distinguish between actual dominance and the far more common phenomenon, perceived dominance constructed entirely in the observer's mind. In social environments, most individuals continuously signal intent through micro-expressions, hand movement, verbal fillers, and reactive facial shifts. However, certain individuals display a reduced signal pattern, fewer gestures, slower responses, minimal emotional oscillation. This creates a cognitive gap in the observer. The brain, designed to predict intention, begins filling in missing data. When behavioral input decreases, predictive inference increases, and inference is always shaped by internal bias, not external truth. What feels like intimidation is often the nervous system attempting to resolve uncertainty in a low information target detection tool. If someone consistently feels hard to read, observe whether the ambiguity comes from them or from your inability to categorize them quickly. This sets the foundation for the second layer: gaze behavior. Human beings are highly sensitive to eye behavior, not just eye contact, but stability, duration, and timing of disengagement. Research in social neurobiology shows that rapid gaze shifts are subconsciously interpreted as deference or social searching behavior. Conversely, steady gaze, especially without accompanying emotional display, can be misclassified as dominance. But the key detail is not staring, it is absence of reactive avoidance. The brain does not interpret eye contact as confidence. It interprets lack of withdrawal as control. This explains why certain individuals appear intimidating even when they are not emotionally intense. They are simply not performing social appeasement signals. Detection tool. Notice whether discomfort arises from their gaze itself or from the absence of expected social signaling. This leads into posture and spatial control. Individuals who occupy space without unnecessary movement tend to be perceived as higher status. This is not cultural, it is neurological. The brain associates unnecessary motion with uncertainty and low hierarchical position. Stillness, when paired with environmental awareness, creates a perception of control over surroundings. Importantly, this is not about size or physical strength. It is about economy of motion. People who move only when necessary reduce the number of predictive variables others can track. Intimidation often emerges when the observer loses the ability to predict next action based on motion cues. Detection tool: ask whether the person is actually doing less or whether your attention is overweighting their lack of unnecessary movement. At this stage, perception begins to stabilize into a narrative of dominance, but the next layer complicates it. But here is where it becomes more complex. Studies in social anxiety and hypervigilance show that individuals who feel intimidated easily are more likely to assign dominance to neutral faces, neutral postures, and even emotionally absent behavior. In other words, intimidation is not always projected outward. It is often constructed internally through threat sensitivity calibration. This reverses the assumption. Sometimes the intimidating person is not broadcasting dominance at all. The observer is amplifying ambiguity into threat, and the brain does this automatically when it lacks social certainty. A less discussed factor is emotional containment, the ability to regulate visible emotional leakage. Most people display microreactivity, slight facial shifts during disagreement, subtle eyebrow movement during evaluation, or tonal fluctuation during uncertainty. Individuals with high emotional containment show reduced variance in expression. This is often misread as detachment or superiority, but neurologically it reflects tighter top-down regulation of emotional expression, not emotional absence. What appears as coldness is often simply the absence of visible emotional feedback loops. Detection tool: observe whether the perceived intimidation comes from actual hostility or from the lack of emotional confirmation signals. This connects directly to social prediction systems in the brain. The human brain is fundamentally a prediction engine. It continuously constructs models of how others will behave next. When prediction is easy, comfort increases. When prediction fails, alertness increases. Certain individuals trigger prediction instability simply by being consistent in unpredictable ways, not erratic, but minimally expressive across contexts. This creates what neuroscientists refer to as low-confidence social modeling. The result is subjective discomfort interpreted as intimidation. But again, no aggression is required. The brain often confuses unable to predict with potential threat. Detection tool: if someone feels intimidating, test whether their behavior is actually harmful or merely difficult to model quickly. Humans assign status rapidly based on incomplete information. This is adaptive in ancestral environments, but error-prone in modern social systems. When uncertainty is high, the brain defaults to status assignment rather than ambiguity. Thus, neutral individuals can be assigned high dominance simply because they resist easy categorization. This is reinforced by social comparison bias, the tendency to evaluate others relative to internal expectations of behavior. But here is the deeper mechanism. Status is often projected, not expressed. People rarely detect dominance. They construct it to resolve uncertainty. This is why two observers can describe the same person as calm and intimidating simultaneously. At this point, a structural truth emerges. Intimidation is not a property of individuals. It is a relational output between signal clarity and observer sensitivity. Some people are perceived as intimidating not because they project force, but because they reduce interpretability. Others feel intimidated not because they are weak, but because their prediction systems over-interpret ambiguity. If this pattern holds across environments and workplaces, relationships, casual encounters, then the implication is direct. Human beings are constantly assigning invisible narratives to one another based on incomplete data and treating those narratives as reality. What appears as social truth is often just cognitive completion under uncertainty. Now that the mechanism is visible, the observation changes. First, distinguish signal from interpretation. Ask whether the person is actually doing anything threatening or whether your prediction system is filling gaps. Second, track motion economy. High control individuals do not necessarily move less. They move only when functionally required. Third, identify emotional confirmation bias. If someone feels intimidating, check whether they are withholding emotion or whether you are expecting emotional signaling that is not being provided. Finally, observe your own threshold for ambiguity. Intimidation often reflects tolerance limits, not external threat. One sentence remains: what feels like dominance in others is often just the moment your brain stops understanding them quickly enough to feel comfortable. Next exploration is not about intimidation, but about why the mind mistakes familiarity for trust, even when it is statistically unreliable.